Far beyond the edges of the known galaxy, in the forgotten silence between stars, there lived a child who did not belong to history. No records, no name. Only a presence in the Force, subtle yet impossible to ignore. His birth was never documented. No one charted the system he came from. And the species he belonged to, small in form, slow in aging, has remained one of the galaxy's most enduring mysteries. Not because of power, but because of absence, as if nature itself had chosen to hide them. But this child was different. Even in infancy, he could feel things before they happened. He would reach toward lights that hadn't yet appeared, wake before storms arrived, and fall silent when the air turned cold with death. The Force was not something he learned. It was something he had always known. His homeworld, unnamed, unmarked, was more forest than city, more stillness than civilization. And yet, the boy's presence stirred something ancient within it. The trees bent toward him. Animals kept their distance. His people, few and cautious, watched him from afar. They did not fear him, but they did not understand him either. One day, that changed. A Republic vessel, old, damaged, nearly lost, drifted into the system, by accident, or perhaps by the will of something older than navigation. Aboard were two Jedi Knights, returning from a failed diplomatic mission. Supplies were low, morale lower, but as they passed over the unregistered world, one of them felt something. A calling, faint but unmistakable. They landed without knowing why. And there, at the edge of a quiet lake, they found him. Not crying, not running, just waiting. He looked at them not with fear, but with recognition, as if he had been expecting them all along. One of the Jedi would later say, "It was like he had already seen our faces in a dream." The child didn't speak, but he reached forward, not with hands, with presence, with peace, and something else, too. Loneliness. The Jedi understood, not everything, but enough. This was no ordinary child. This was something the galaxy had not seen in generations. They took him aboard. He left nothing behind. No family, no keepsake, no name. From that moment forward, he belonged to the Order. And yet, the Order would never truly understand him. Even among the youngest initiates, he was different. He listened more than he spoke. He observed patterns others missed. When he meditated, he would not return for hours. And when he dreamed, he saw faces he had never met. The archives say his connection to the Force was exceptionally high. But that was not what set him apart. It was the silence, the stillness inside him. Like a storm waiting far away, quiet, but inevitable. They named him Yoda. No meaning, no translation. Just a sound that felt right. And from that day forward, the child of no world began his journey. He would not wield a lightsaber for many years. He would not take a Padawan. He would not speak to the council. For now, he was just a youngling, one among many. But even then, the Force watched him. Because deep in its current, something had shifted. He was barely more than a child when he entered the temple. Not in years, those moved differently for his kind, but in presence. The Jedi took him not because they understood him, but because they couldn't. And the Order feared what it could not guide. Coruscant was louder than anything he had ever felt. The air hummed with ships. The ground vibrated with the movement of thousands. But the temple itself was quiet. A quiet that did not comfort him. He had come from a world of living forests, gentle rain, and silence between thought. Now he stood in marble halls, ancient, ordered, sacred, but cold. The Jedi High Council observed him through distant eyes. They sensed what the scouts had reported, a deep resonance in the Force, pure and steady. But beneath it, something older, a presence that did not move with the rest, as if he listened to a current none of them could hear. He said little, asked less. But when he did speak, his words came slow, deliberate, like someone still learning how speech worked in this part of the galaxy. He trained with the other younglings. They ran, they stumbled, they sparred. He watched. When he moved, it was with intention. He did not waste energy. He did not lose focus. Even at such an early stage, his stillness set him apart. The instructors noticed. Some called it discipline, others called it detachment. But to him, it was neither. It was how he survived the noise. Within weeks, he was placed in the care of Master Tanis, an elder Jedi with no Padawan and eyes that had seen too much. Tanis did not treat the child like a curiosity. He treated him like a question. "You listen before you breathe," the old master once said to him. Yoda did not answer. He only bowed. The Force training began slow, breath work, sensing, lifting stones with the mind. The child advanced without effort, but it wasn't the technique that marked him, it was the way he responded to failure. Calm, still, patient. When his peers grew frustrated, he remained focused. When they competed, he withdrew. There was no desire in him to win, only to understand. It unsettled the others. And as time passed, some whispered that he was too quiet, too strange, too distant. He heard them, but he did not change. Because every night, when the dormitory lights dimmed and the others fell asleep, Yoda would sit upright in meditation, eyes open, staring at nothing. But he was not alone, not in those moments. The Force would come to him then, not in words, not in visions, but in feeling. He sensed the breath of ancient things. He heard echoes of stars dying, and once, just once, he thought he felt something call his name. But no one ever said it, because Yoda did not share these moments. He did not seek praise, he did not fear rejection. He simply endured. Over time, he passed each trial laid before him. He constructed his first training saber. He completed the gathering under the guidance of Professor Hao Yong. He stepped into the crystal caves of Elam, and the Force guided him to his Kyber. It was green, not because he willed it, because it knew him. By the end of his first century, he was no longer a youngling. He was a Padawan. Not yet a warrior, not yet a master, but no longer a question. And though he said little, others had begun to whisper his name with wonder. Yoda, a name that, one day, the galaxy would speak with reverence. But for now, remained just a quiet presence in the halls of the temple. Waiting, watching, becoming. The years passed quietly, and in that quiet, the boy became something else. He did not seek greatness. He did not hunger for power. He sought balance, though he did not yet understand what that meant. As a Padawan, Yoda traveled with his master across countless worlds of the Republic. He watched more than he spoke. He listened more than he acted. To those who met him, he seemed small and unassuming, a creature of few words, a shadow beside a teacher far larger than himself. But those who could feel the Force knew the truth. The stillness around him was not emptiness, it was depth. He could sense when danger would rise before it appeared. He could feel the sorrow in those they healed, even when no tears were shed. He could hear the hum of the Force beneath every sound, every life, every breath. There were moments on those journeys that tested him. A planet torn by famine, a settlement gripped by fear. When he saw people starving, he questioned the Order's restraint. Why must we only protect, he asked within himself, when we can prevent? But his master's silence was answer enough. The Jedi did not rule, they served. And service, Yoda learned, demanded the surrender of self. In that lesson, he found peace. But it was a peace built on control, not understanding. His first real trial came not from war or darkness, but from loss. On a world consumed by disease, Yoda and his master spent months trying to heal the sick. The illness was not of the body, but of the mind, spreading through fear, faster than any cure. When the sickness reached his master, Yoda did everything the Force allowed. He failed. He stayed beside him until the end, listening to his breathing fade. There were no final words, no farewell, only stillness. And when the stillness broke, it was only because Yoda whispered something soft enough for the Force alone to hear. That day, he learned what silence truly meant. He buried his master beneath a tree older than the Republic. Then, for the first time in his long life, he meditated not to learn but to grieve. It was in that meditation that something changed. He felt the Force not as energy or sound, but as presence, vast, endless, and alive. It spoke to him without voice. Not comfort, not instruction, only truth. Loss is not the absence of the Force, it is how the Force remembers. When he returned to Coruscant, he was different. The Council sensed it, the Temple echoed with it. He no longer hesitated when he spoke, yet he spoke only when needed. And when he looked at others, they sometimes turned away because it felt like he could see what they were hiding, even from themselves. It was not power, it was awareness. Within a few decades, he was granted the rank of knight. Not for victory, not for valor, but for endurance. He spent years alone afterward, traveling to places untouched by the Order, ancient ruins on Ossus, lost temples beneath Dathomir's surface, worlds where the Force whispered through the bones of the earth. He listened, he learned, he remembered, and in time he began to teach. Those who trained under him found his lessons strange. He did not tell them what to think, he asked what they felt. He did not warn them of the dark side, he made them listen to its quiet pull. He did not punish mistakes, he made them understand why they mattered. The Council began to take notice. Yoda had grown wise not through age, but through silence. And in that silence, the Force itself seemed to move with him. By the time Yoda reached his second century, he had already seen more of the galaxy than most Jedi would in a lifetime. He had walked the ruins of fallen civilizations, listened to the echoes of ancient battles, and stood beneath the suns of dying worlds. But in all that movement, he began to feel something that would follow him for the rest of his life. A sense of distance. Not from the Force, from others. Jedi came and went, Padawans rose and fell. Masters grew old and passed into the Force, but Yoda remained unchanged, unshaken, quietly observing the galaxy move around him. At first, he believed this was balance. He told himself that detachment was the path of peace, that distance protected both himself and others, that silence preserved clarity. But there were moments, quiet ones, when he would sit alone in his chamber, surrounded by the hum of Coruscant's endless city, and wonder, what would it mean to be known? He had never spoken of his home world, never searched for his origins, never asked why his kind were so rare. Not because he lacked curiosity, because he feared the answer would make him choose. The Jedi were his family, the temple, his shelter. But deep within, there was a part of him untouched by doctrine, a place the code could not reach. It whispered to him in sleep, not as a warning, as a reminder, you do not belong here. Still, he served, and he served well. He trained new initiates in the ways of the Force, guiding them with patience no other knight could match. He watched them grow, watched them falter, watched them pass beyond him, always with a smile, always with stillness. But each one left a mark, a memory, a scar. He began to carry them, all of them, silently. And as the decades wore on, those memories became heavier than any saber. When he meditated, he could feel the presence of every student he had known. He saw their triumphs, their failures, their falls. One, in particular, stayed with him. A student of great promise, brave, strong in the Force, but impatient, proud. Yoda tried to guide him, but his warnings were soft, his approach distant. The student left the order, not in anger, in certainty. He believed the Jedi had become weak. That peace was a lie. That power should be pursued, not restrained. He took the name Dooku, and though he was still young, Yoda felt something fracture inside him the day Dooku turned away. Not just regret, responsibility. It was the first time Yoda questioned whether wisdom alone was enough. But there were no answers, only more silence. He spent more time alone after that, in meditation rooms, in archives, in the stars. He traveled without companions, not because he preferred solitude, because he could no longer bear the weight of losing another. And so, Master Yoda, already a legend in whispers, began to walk a path that few could follow. One of great power, but quiet sorrow. He had not yet joined the High Council. He had not yet seen the Clone Wars. He had not yet faced the Emperor. But already, something had taken root inside him. The understanding that even in the heart of the Order, he was alone. And the Force, ever present, ever watching, did not offer comfort, only purpose. Yoda accepted it. He always had. But sometimes, when the temple was dark, when no one else could hear, he would whisper into the Force, asking a question he had never spoken aloud. Is this what it means to serve? There was never an answer. Only the echo of his own voice, faint, distant, and very, very old. He never told anyone the name, the one who trained him, the Jedi Master who first reached into the silence and pulled Yoda forward from it. The archives hold no record, not because it was lost, but because Yoda never shared it. Not with the Council, not with his students, not with the Force itself. It was one of the few truths he chose to keep for himself. A single bond, private, buried, and untouched. But what little is known begins here. Yoda's master was not loud in the Order, not powerful. They walked the temple halls with a gait that made no sound, and when they spoke, it was never to be heard, only understood. Their connection to the Force was not raw. It was refined, deep. And that was why they were chosen for Yoda. The boy had grown in silence. He did not need instruction shouted at him. He needed someone who understood the power of quiet guidance. Yoda followed them without question. They spoke rarely, but when they did, it mattered. Not every Padawan bonded with their master. Some were taught, others were shaped, but Yoda, he mirrored. He began to walk as his master walked, waited before he spoke, like they did. He even meditated where they did beneath the same tree in the temple gardens, where the light passed through the branches in soft layers, like waves of thought. His lightsaber training began slowly. Unlike other Padawans, he struggled at first. His size was a challenge, his reach limited, his strength uncertain. But he never complained. He would stay behind after the sessions ended, practicing alone in the echoing halls. No instruction, just movement, again, and again, and again. His master never corrected him. They only watched. And in time, Yoda found his own rhythm, one that was not about power, but precision. It was the first time he realized that control did not require force. It required understanding. His master taught him little through words, but they led him into places few Jedi ever saw. The temple's deepest vaults, the old meditation chambers carved before the High Republic, ancient halls where murals told stories not taught to younglings. They would stand in silence before them. And after long moments, his master would ask a single question, always the same. What does this mean to you? Not what is the history, not what was the outcome, but what he saw, what he felt. And Yoda began to understand. This was not just training. This was shaping, not of technique, but of perception. Other Padawans learned the rules. He was learning to see the space between them. There were times they traveled off-world, to forgotten shrines, to remote outposts, to places where the Force bent sideways. One world its name never recorded changed something in him. They found ruins, overgrown, abandoned. But beneath the surface, echoes. A dark place, not strong enough to corrupt, but old enough to remember pain. His master let him walk into it alone. No guidance, no protection, only silence. And in that silence, he felt something, not fear, but weight. The memory of suffering. Not his, but someone else's. Long gone, still echoing. He came out changed. He didn't speak for 2 days. And when he did, it was only one sentence. I understand what it means to fall. His master did not reply. They only placed a hand on his shoulder, not to praise him, to steady him, because this was just the beginning. The Force had more to show him, and not all of it would be gentle. The mission began as routine, a survey, a diplomatic escort, a quiet test for a young Padawan and his master. The Republic had sent them to a border world near the mid-rim green valleys, fractured settlements, people weary of both Jedi and warlords. It was meant to be safe. But the Force never promised safety. When they landed, the air felt wrong, heavy. Still, Yoda said nothing, but his eyes followed the horizon as though he was reading a language only he could see. His master felt it too. The disturbance, a tension under the soil, older than the conflict that now simmered on its surface. They spent days mediating between the settlers and the local militia. Both sides accused the other of theft, of raids, of deceit. And through it all, Yoda observed small, quiet, invisible to their anger. But the night before the final negotiation, something changed. He woke to the sound of crying. Not human, not mechanical, something else. He followed it into the dark, past the camp, past the torches, until he reached the edge of a ravine, where the stars bent low against the mist. There, he saw them. A group of children, thin, cold, hiding in the shadow of the rocks. Not rebels, not soldiers. Victims. When he reached out to them, they backed away, fear in their eyes. And he realized they weren't crying from hunger. They were crying because they had seen what fear could do. The militia had used them, forced them to spy, to steal, to survive. They were barely alive. He wanted to help. He wanted to save them. But the code whispered in his mind, "Do not act from attachment. Do not let emotion lead the way." He hesitated. And in that hesitation, the sound of blast of fire split the night. His master's voice called out from the camp, a warning, sharp and distant. Smoke rose through the trees. The children screamed. Yoda turned back, torn between duty and compassion. And for the first time in his life, he felt fear. Not for himself. For them. He ran toward the camp, the ground trembling beneath each step. But when he arrived, it was already too late. The militia had turned on the settlers. Chaos consumed the valley. The force was loud, too loud. Yoda tried to intervene, deflecting bolts, disarming soldiers, guiding the frightened away. But in the storm of confusion, the children he had found, the ones he had hesitated to save, were caught in the crossfire. Their voices vanished beneath the sound of war. And in that silence, something inside him broke. When the battle ended, only ashes remained. The Republic would later call it a miscommunication, a tragic misunderstanding. But Yoda knew what it truly was. A lesson. His master found him kneeling in the mud, his eyes unfocused. He didn't cry. He couldn't. He only whispered, "I felt it before it came. I knew, and I did nothing." His master didn't scold him, didn't offer comfort. They simply said, "The Force shows. It does not choose. That is left to us." The words burned. Yoda carried them like a scar, invisible but deep. He had faced battle before, but never failure. Never the weight of indecision. That night, he sat beside the dying fire, staring at the stars above the valley. They looked peaceful, unmoved. He wondered if the Force could feel guilt, if it regretted what it allowed to happen. And for the first time since his training began, he questioned whether he was truly meant to serve it. The next morning, they left the planet. Neither spoke. The silence between them was not distance. It was grief. A quiet wound shared by both. And for Yoda, it would never fully heal. The return to Coruscant was quiet. No celebration, no briefing. Just two Jedi walking through the temple's great halls, one burdened by failure, the other by understanding. The council reviewed the mission. They spoke of tragedy, of lost lives, of lessons to be learned. But Yoda barely heard them. The words drifted through him like echoes through an empty chamber. He stood at the center of the council floor, smaller than ever, while the masters debated who was to blame. None of them looked at him. None of them asked how he felt. Because to the Jedi, emotion was a thing to master, not to feel. But Yoda's heart was not calm. It was breaking slowly, silently. When the session ended, his master placed a hand on his shoulder. They did not speak. They didn't need to. That night, Yoda returned to the meditation garden. The same tree, the same silence, but it no longer felt peaceful. He sat there for hours, trying to find the stillness he once carried so easily. But the force was restless within him, twisting, echoing with the screams of the valley, the faces of the children, the sound of his own hesitation. He wanted to bury it, to let go, to be the Jedi he was supposed to be. But he couldn't. Not yet. When dawn broke, his master joined him. They stood together as the city below came alive. After a long silence, Yoda finally spoke. "Why does the Force allow pain?" His master's answer came soft, almost regretful. "Because without pain, there is no understanding." Yoda looked away. "Then understanding feels cruel." "It is," his master replied, "but it is also the only thing that lasts." That day marked the end of Yoda's innocence. He still believed in peace. He still served the Order. But something had shifted the way he looked at the galaxy, and the way the galaxy looked back. He threw himself into study, history, philosophy, Force alignment. He sought the wisdom of the Jedi archives, searching for answers the Force refused to give. Weeks passed, then months, and slowly he began to change. His lightsaber form evolved, no longer slow and uncertain, but precise, deliberate, impossible to predict. He learned to turn his size into advantage, his stillness into misdirection. Every motion became a choice, every word a tool. But even as he grew stronger, the quiet ache within him remained. His master noticed, and so they gave him a task, one final test before he could stand on his own. A group of initiates had lost their instructor in an accident during training. Their lessons had stopped, their spirits were low. Yoda was asked to guide them. He hesitated. Teaching required patience, compassion, hope. All things he feared he no longer carried. But he accepted. At first, the younglings did not understand him. He spoke slowly, asked questions instead of giving answers. He taught them how to listen, not to win. He reminded them that failure was not weakness, it was truth. And in teaching them, something in him healed, bit by bit. One evening, as the sun set beyond the temple spires, one of the students asked him, "Master, will we always be afraid?" Yoda smiled, faintly. "Afraid, yes, but brave also. Same feeling, they are. What we do with them, that is the choice." It was the first time he spoke like a teacher. The first time his words carried weight beyond himself. His master watched from afar. Their lesson was complete. They had not taught Yoda how to win or how to lead. They had taught him how to live with loss and still serve the light. It was the lesson that hurt, the one that would define him for centuries. He was not yet a master, but those around him had already begun to look to him as one. Yoda had passed the trials of skill, of spirit, and of self. But the Force was not done testing him. Because there was one trial that could not be measured: obedience. Not to the council, not to his master, but to the will of the Order. Even when it hurt. The Republic was changing. Whispers of unrest moved across systems like wind through dry leaves. Worlds grew distant. Senators argued more than they listened. And on the outer rim, Small wars sparked and vanished before anyone could name them. Yoda was sent to one such world. Not to fight, to observe. His orders were clear. Do not interfere. Do not expose the Jedi. Report only. He followed them, without question, because that was what it meant to serve. The planet was quiet, scarred by recent conflict. An ambitious governor had risen to power through fear, keeping order by force, silencing dissidents, and branding any who resisted as traitors. The Republic knew, but they looked away. Stability, they said, was preferable to collapse. Yoda remained hidden in the forests outside the capital. He watched. He listened. He said nothing. One night, he crept into a village burned weeks earlier. The walls still smoked. The people were gone. He found only remnants: a child's boot, a half-melted droid head, and the blackened ring of what had once been a communal fire. He returned to his post, filed his report, obeyed. But something inside him began to pull. The same feeling from the valley. The same weight. The same silence. A week later, he witnessed an execution. 3 civilians accused of hiding stolen food. No trial. No mercy. Yoda stood on the rooftops, cloaked in shadow, hands still. He could have intervened, stopped it all. No one would have seen him. No one would have known. But the order would. And the code was clear. Do not act from emotion. Do not become judge. Do not become sword. So he obeyed. And in doing so, something in him died. When he returned to Coruscant, the mission was labeled successful. The planet was stable. No Jedi exposure. No political fallout. The council nodded in approval. His master said nothing. But Yoda, he could no longer sit in the meditation chamber the same way. He could no longer look at the stars without hearing the silence of those who could not scream. He had done everything right, followed the code, served the order, and still the innocent had burned. He asked the council a question during their next session. If obedience leads to injustice, have we served the Force, or only ourselves? They did not answer. Not directly. Only Mace Windu, already rising in the ranks, met his eyes and said, "The Jedi are not warriors. We are peacekeepers. We serve the balance." But balance, Yoda had begun to see, was not peace. It was pressure. A scale forced into stillness. And every time he obeyed without action, he wondered which side he was truly standing on. His master left the temple shortly after. Whether to meditate, to serve, or to disappear, Yoda never knew. He never asked, and he never saw them again. What they had taught him remained. But now, he had to walk forward alone. With knowledge, with pain, with silence, the council offered him a place among the knights. He accepted, not because he felt ready, but because he no longer had the luxury of waiting. From that moment forward, obedience became a choice, and every choice left a shadow. He did not ask to be a knight. The title was given, not earned through glory or battle. He had passed his trials, endured loss, obeyed when it hurt, and remained loyal when it would have been easier to walk away. The council voted without debate. Yoda was ready, but he didn't feel ready. Because deep down, he knew the truth. Wisdom wasn't something you achieved. It was something you carried. And already, it was beginning to feel heavy. The first years of his knighthood passed quietly. He took assignments others avoided, long, distant missions that stretched across the outer rim, through forgotten systems and unsettled territories. Not because he wanted solitude, but because he feared becoming what others expected. He was still small, still quiet, still easy to miss in a crowded chamber. But his presence in the Force had begun to shift. It wasn't louder, it was deeper, like still water hiding a vast ocean beneath. He never refused a mission, never questioned an order, but he watched everything, every world torn by greed, every government that played peacekeeper while sowing war, every desperate family crushed between ideologies they couldn't afford to understand. Yoda saw it all, and with each new assignment, a truth settled deeper into his bones. The Jedi could not fix the galaxy. They could guide, they could help, but the more they tried to control, the more they became part of the problem. Still, he served, because he believed in the light, even when it flickered, even when it burned. He was sent to the mid-rim when a Force-sensitive child had been discovered by accident. She was 6, afraid, and powerful. Her parents begged to keep her, promised to protect her, promised she could live in peace. Yoda watched her from the shadows of their home, saw the tremble in her hands, the flicker of light around her fingers when she was scared. He saw what she was becoming, what the galaxy would do to her, and what the dark would whisper in time. He took her, gently, without force, but without choice. She cried as the ship lifted off. So did her parents. Yoda did not. He sat with her in the quiet of the transport, did not promise safety, did not promise peace. He only said, "You will not be alone." But as he looked at her, he realized the words were not for her. They were for himself. Because for all his wisdom, he had not forgotten what it felt like to be taken. He trained her for a time, guided her as others had guided him. She was bright, gentle, strong. But like all things in the Order, she was passed on, assigned to another. That was the way. Attachment was forbidden, even the quiet kind. He told himself it was right. He told himself the pain would pass. And he was correct. The pain did pass. But something else stayed. A faint numbness, the kind that comes from surviving too many goodbyes. The decades began to blur. Padawans came and went. Fellow knights rose and fell. Some became legends. Others became lost. Yoda remained, not because he was chosen, but because time had not yet chosen to move him aside. And in that stillness, in that space between years, the Force began to show him things. Patterns, shadows, paths that crossed before they ever met. But no one else seemed to notice. Or if they did, they said nothing. He began to wonder if this was what wisdom truly meant. Not knowing more, but being alone in knowing it. And yet, he never stopped listening. Because one day, he believed, the galaxy might finally be ready to hear him. The Council called him back, not to elevate him, not to question him, but to ask him why he had stopped speaking. Yoda had never been loud, but now he said even less than before. In briefings, he nodded. In debate, he listened. And when he was asked for his thoughts, he paused. Because more and more, he found that words were insufficient. The galaxy was speaking in silence now, a language of decay, of repetition, of old mistakes wearing new names. He could hear it, but most had stopped listening. He stood before the council, smaller than everyone else in the room. But he did not feel small. Mace Windu, not yet a master but already formidable, watched him carefully. Ki-Adi-Mundi sat with arms crossed, always skeptical of what could not be measured. Even Yaddle, one of his few kin, and one of the few who understood his silence, waited. They asked what he had seen on Dathomir. The reports were incomplete. The Force readings were unclear. Yoda said only this: "It is not only the Jedi who listen to the Force." There was a pause. Then, a dismissal. He returned to his quarters. Alone. Outside, Coruscant glittered, a city of light atop a world of shadow. And Yoda began to wonder if the temple had become the same. He started spending more time in the archives. Not for research, for memory. He studied the old masters, holocrons of Tython, transcripts from the Great Hyperspace War, echoes of voices long dead, all saying the same thing in different words. Beware the comfort of righteousness. Yoda remembered that line. He carved it into the wall behind his meditation space. Not as a lesson to teach others, but as a warning to himself. He was invited to oversee trials, to mentor initiates, to advise missions. He accepted them all, not because he sought influence, but because he understood what was being asked of him. The Jedi Order was growing, too fast, too proud, and the cracks were beginning to show. His students were strong, too strong. He saw the way they pushed the limits of the code. Not from rebellion, from belief. They believed they were the light. Not servants of the Force, but the Force itself, shaped into weapon and will. Yoda never corrected them publicly. He asked questions, made them uncomfortable, made them think. Some appreciated it. Most didn't. But a few, a rare few, began to change. And that was enough. He took to walking the halls at night, when the temple was silent. He would pause outside the meditation chambers, stand beneath the Kyber archways, place a hand on the stone of the archives. And every now and then, he would speak aloud. To no one, or to the Force. "Not ready, we are," he would whisper. "See, they will not." And sometimes the Force would answer, not in words, but in breath, in stillness, in the flicker of lights above him. He did not sleep much anymore, not because of nightmares, but because rest had become a luxury he could not justify. Too much was shifting. Too many ignored the warnings. So he watched. He waited. He became the one whose presence calmed rooms. The one whose silence carried more weight than speeches. He was still a knight, but already the Order leaned on him like a foundation stone. And Yoda began to understand. Wisdom wasn't something you were given. It was something you paid for. With time, with grief, with loneliness. And now, the cost was only beginning. He never sought the title, but in time, it found him. The council gathered in quiet agreement. After decades of service, of silence, and of choices few could make without breaking, Yoda was elevated to master. There was no ceremony, no celebration. Only acknowledgement, a simple nod from peers who had begun to see him not as one of many, but as something enduring. He accepted with humility, and then he returned to work. His first years as master were filled with students. Dozens of them young, restless, filled with potential and pride. They looked to him for wisdom. They found instead questions they didn't want to answer. Yoda never told them what to think. He told them to listen, to feel, to question why the Force spoke in whispers rather than commands. Some called his methods strange, others frustrating. But over time, his students began to see that his silence was not absence. It was reflection. He once told a Padawan who had failed her trial, "Lost you are not, simply unfinished." The words spread through the temple like light through water. Soft, enduring. Years passed. The Order began to rely on him not just for counsel, but for calm. When debates grew heated, Yoda would simply enter the chamber and the argument would fade. No command, no authority, only presence. He served on the council rarely at first, observing more than leading. But even then, others deferred to him. They trusted his vision, though he never claimed to see farther than anyone else. He simply saw differently. He began to travel less. The wars of the Outer Rim were fading, replaced by political unrest and small conflicts that never truly ended. The Republic called for intervention. The Jedi answered. But Yoda watched, uneasy. He saw something shifting in the way the Jedi spoke. Too certain, too absolute. As if peace was a weapon they alone could wield. He warned them quietly. Blind we may become, if only light we see. But the words were heard, not understood. To most, he was the perfect Jedi, incorruptible, steady, eternal. But within him, doubts grew stronger. He had lived through the rise and fall of generations, and he had begun to recognize the pattern. Peace never lasted. War always returned. And the Jedi, for all their wisdom, repeated the same mistakes. He found no rest in this truth. Not in meditation, not in duty, not in the endless cycle of teaching those who would outlive him only to fall where others had stood. One evening, he sat alone in the archives, surrounded by the blue glow of ancient holocrons. He opened one, a record from a master who lived 3,000 years before. The voice said, "Every century, the Jedi forget the lessons of the last. The Force does not change. We do." Yoda closed the device. He didn't need to hear more, because he had begun to understand what the holocron could not say. That wisdom was not a gift of age. It was a wound. A reminder that survival meant watching the galaxy make the same choices again and again, knowing you could not stop it. He looked out over Coruscant that night. The lights below shimmered like stars reversed, and for a moment, he wondered which side of the sky he truly belonged to. The Order called him its greatest teacher, the Republic its quiet guardian. But Yoda knew neither title was truth. He was not great. He was not at peace. He was simply still. And in that stillness, he began to sense the faint stirring of something dark, distant, yet familiar. Not born yet, but waiting. A shadow that would one day test everything he had endured to protect. Time did not pass for Yoda the way it passed for others. Not because he was untouched by age, but because he outlived the meaning others gave to it. The decades became blurred. Faces changed. Voices faded. And the ones he had trained, the hopeful, the bold, the brilliant, either vanished into legend or into memory. He remembered them all. The ones who passed their trials, the ones who did not, the ones who rose with humility, and the ones who fell in silence. There was no pattern, no certainty, only the Force moving endlessly forward. He began to walk the temple alone more often, his steps slow, his breath calm. He would pause in the same halls he once sprinted through as a child. And as he stood there no longer student, not quite elder, the air felt thinner, not empty, just quieter. The Order had grown. More worlds, more Jedi, more voices, but Yoda noticed something else growing alongside it. Noise, disagreements masked as debates, pride masked as principle, and a belief quiet but spreading that the Jedi were no longer servants of the Force, but its masters. He felt it most during council sessions. Words were sharper, agreements quicker, warnings dismissed. He spoke only when necessary, and each time, fewer listened. A new generation had risen, confident, efficient, respected by the Senate. They brought order to the galaxy, but they no longer questioned what that order cost. Yoda watched them leave the temple robes clean, lightsabers gleaming, minds sharp with certainty. And he felt a strange ache, not of doubt, of repetition. He had seen this before, centuries ago, when another council on another world had ignored the whispers of imbalance. That council had fallen, and the Jedi with it. But this one believed they could not fall. And that belief, Yoda feared, was the beginning. He no longer feared the dark. He feared the blindness of light. He visited the Kyber vaults more often, not to draw power, to listen. Each crystal hummed in its own way, some warm, some cold, some silent. He ran his hand across them, eyes closed, letting the Force speak. One crystal pulsed faintly, a pale green, not yet claimed. He paused. It reminded him of a Padawan he once trained. The boy had promise, kindness, but too much fear. He was lost in a skirmish near Malastare. His name had been removed from the archives. Too much sorrow, the council said. Better to forget. But Yoda didn't forget. Couldn't. Because forgetting meant pretending the cost had never been paid. That was the burden. Not the teaching. Not the leadership. Not the wisdom others praised him for. The burden was memory. And memory, when stretched across centuries, became a wound that never closed. He once told a student, "Time is not your ally. It only gives you more to carry." Now, he understood what he meant. The galaxy looked peaceful. Ships moved in clean lanes. Senators smiled through agreements. And the temple stood tall, brilliant against the sky. But beneath it all, Yoda could feel the tremble. Not loud, not now, but close. Like something waiting to be born. He sat alone in the meditation chamber as evening fell, letting the shadows climb the walls. He did not seek answers, only understanding. The Force stirred, not with light, not with dark, but with warning. The years had not ended. They had only paused. And in that stillness, Yoda prepared himself, because survival was not strength, and wisdom was never without cost. It did not begin with an invasion, not with fleets or fire or fleets of banners waving in defiance. It began in silence, as it always does. Rumors whispered across the outer rim. trade disputes spiraling into blockades, old alliances quietly broken, and systems once loyal to the Republic falling strangely quiet. The Jedi Council saw the tension but hoped it would pass. They had known wars before. They believed this would be the same. Yoda did not agree. He felt the disturbance long before the Council named it. Not in politics, not in strategy, in the Force, a tremor, like a storm forming beneath calm waters, far away, but moving closer. He stood alone in the high spire of the temple, watching the sky darken over Coruscant. He said nothing, but the silence inside him had changed. It no longer whispered questions. It waited for something to break. The first reports came from the Tinja Alarm. 3 Republic patrols had gone missing near Farlene. No distress signals, no survivors. The Jedi sent investigators. Only one returned, and he returned broken. What he described made no sense. He spoke of a presence, a voice in the dark, a weapon that moved through shadows and thought. The Council dismissed it as trauma. Yoda did not. He remembered what the archives had buried, that the Sith, though thought extinct, had not simply vanished. They had learned to wait. And he feared they were no longer waiting. It was then that the conflict began to show itself. A separatist movement in the Atravis sector, a failed coup on Naboo, an assassination in the Senate quietly erased from the record. And then, war. Not declared, not named, but real. Yoda was sent to Iridonia, a world of warriors, proud and restless. A civil conflict had turned violent. The Republic had sent peacekeepers. None had returned. He arrived with 3 Jedi, 2 knights, 1 Padawan. They expected negotiation. They found a battlefield. The ground was scorched, the cities abandoned, and among the ruins, something darker. The Padawan was the first to feel it. She collapsed without warning, whispering in a language no one recognized. Yoda knelt beside her, placed his hand to her temple, and listened. What he heard chilled him. Not words, memories, not hers. Someone else's. Someone ancient. They left that world in silence. They had not failed their mission. They had simply found no one left to save. Back at the temple, the Council grew restless. Whispers of war were becoming reality. And still, no enemy had shown their face. Yoda began to speak more during sessions. Not with fear, but with warning. The dark returns not with armies, but with silence. They listened, but they did not change. He began traveling again. To the front lines that weren't yet called front lines. He led missions that weren't yet called battles. And each time, he saw the same thing: systems falling, not from strength, but from despair. The people no longer trusted the Republic. And in that emptiness, someone was offering them power. Yoda felt it in the Force, a pressure behind every choice, every death, every failure. It wasn't a war yet, but it would be. And when it came, he feared it would not end. He sat alone in his quarters the night before his next deployment. His hands rested on the floor, his saber untouched, his eyes closed. He reached into the Force deeper than he had ever dared. And what he felt was not destruction. It was hunger. Something had awakened. Not new. Old. Older than the temple. Older than the Republic. And it had learned to wait long enough to be forgotten. He opened his eyes. There was no peace in them, only knowing the storm was coming, and the Jedi were not ready. The storm broke without thunder. It arrived in fragment systems, lost, temples burned, messages cut short mid-transmission. For the first time in centuries, the Jedi became soldiers again. They didn't call it war, not yet. They called it containment. But Yoda knew the truth. Every battle the Order fought to end conflict only deepened it. Every victory left another scar. He was stationed on Kashyyyk when the first major uprising began. Wookiee tribes had been forced into war by mercenaries claiming to represent the Republic. But the Republic had sent no such order. When Yoda arrived, he was met by fire. Trees burned like pillars of light in the night sky. And the people he came to save looked at him with fear, not trust. He did not strike back. He did not command troops. He simply raised his hand, and the flames bent away from the village. The air cooled, and for the first time in weeks, the world was quiet again. But peace never lasted. It never does. The mercenaries returned with droids, machines marked by symbols no one recognized. They were crude at first, then more advanced. And the force around them felt wrong, not empty, twisted. He destroyed them all. But when he examined their remains, he found something strange. Sith alchemy burned into their circuits. Not from this age. Older. He sent the fragments to the council. No reply came. A week later, he received new orders. The fighting had spread. The galaxy was unraveling faster than the Jedi could heal it. He left Kashyyyk in silence. The Wookiees bowed to him as he departed. Not in gratitude, in mourning. For they knew what he knew. The war was only beginning. On Coruscant, the council debated endlessly. Who was responsible? How had the Sith returned without revealing themselves? Why did the Force feel colder with each passing year? Yoda sat among them, eyes closed, listening to the same arguments repeat. Peacekeepers who no longer kept peace. Warriors who refused to admit they were at war. He remembered his master's words, the one whose name he never spoke. The Force shows, it does not choose, that is left to us. And he realized how few of them were still choosing at all. The missions grew darker. He led small groups of Jedi into border systems where the Order had lost contact. They expected resistance. They found massacre. Entire temples emptied. Bodies gone. Only silence remained. One world, deep in the expansion region, scarred him more than the rest. Belgoroth. A planet once rich in life, now ash and ruin. The Jedi stationed there had vanished. Not killed, erased. He searched the ruins for hours. Found no life. Until he entered the meditation chamber. There, on the wall, words burned into stone. We reached for the light, and it turned away. He touched the carving. The Force rippled through him. And for the first time, Yoda felt something he had not felt in centuries. Fear. Not for himself, for what would come after him. He saw flashes not of future, not of vision, but of memory that hadn't yet happened. Armies of white, worlds falling in smoke, children screaming through corridors of fire. And in all of it, himself, watching, unable to stop it. He left Belgoroth without speaking. The others thought him calm, but inside, something had begun to fracture. He had been alive too long. He had seen too much. And the Force, once a song, now sounded like a dirge. On the journey back, he meditated in silence. He no longer asked for answers. He only asked for time. Time to prepare. Time to guide. Time to save what little could be saved. But deep down, he already knew. This was not a war that would end. This was a cycle. One that would wait centuries, just to begin again. He opened his eyes to the void of hyperspace. The stars streaked past, endless, untouchable. And for the first time, he understood why the Force had made him live so long. Not to win, but to remember. The war spread like flame through dry grass. Every system that tried to stay neutral was pulled in. Every promise of peace became another reason to fight. And for the first time, the Jedi divided. Some believed intervention was mercy, that the Order must strike first to prevent greater loss. Others insisted that neutrality was the only path to balance. But Yoda saw what neither side would admit. The war had already decided for them. He commanded no army. He did not sit in strategy rooms or count fleets. He walked where the Force led him. World to world, battle to battle, always arriving just as the dying began to quiet. On Arcania, he stood among burning snow. Thousands lay beneath the ice soldiers who had never known what they were fighting for. He felt their deaths in the Force, sharp and endless. And for a moment, he wished he could stop feeling at all. But the Force did not allow him rest. He moved to Malastare, where engines blackened the air and Republic gunships thundered through smoke. The Jedi there had turned the battle into a siege, not of victory, but of survival. When Yoda entered the command tent, the generals fell silent. He gave no orders. He only said, "End this, we must." They obeyed, not out of duty, out of exhaustion. When the fighting stopped, the soldiers looked at him with gratitude that felt more like relief. They didn't thank him for peace. They thanked him for ending noise. Because war, by then, had become a sound that no one could escape. He returned to Coruscant when the war reached its midpoint, though no one could tell where the middle truly was. The Senate called for expansion. The Jedi called for restraint. And Yoda, sitting in his council chair, felt the tremor between both. He realized the truth few wanted to see. The Sith were not winning through battle. They were winning through fatigue. Every world burned, weakened the Republic. Every death numbed the Force. Every victory drained the Jedi until peace felt like surrender. He tried to warn them. The dark side feeds on endurance. Win, we may not, if to survive is all we seek. But the others were too deep within it now. Too burdened. Too proud. So, Yoda left again alone. He traveled to Raxus Prime, a planet of rust and ruin. There, he found the enemy not in armor, but in whispers. Sith acolytes hidden among refugees, speaking of freedom, power, and justice. They didn't fight with sabers. They fought with ideas. And for the first time, Yoda understood why the dark side endured. Because it promised meaning when hope was gone. He fought them not with hate, but with truth. But truth did not always win. When the smoke cleared, half the settlement lay dead. And Yoda was left standing amid ruins he had sworn to prevent. He felt it, then the fatigue of centuries pressing down. The Force moved through him, but it no longer brought clarity. It brought weight. He meditated among the wreckage for 3 days. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't speak. On the third day, The survivors found him still sitting, their eyes open, distant, as if listening to something they could not hear. When he finally rose, he said softly, "To end war, know what peace costs, we must." They didn't understand, but they bowed. He left without looking back. As the years continued, the war burned itself smaller. Not ended. Exhausted. Worlds were left hollow, victory without purpose, peace without joy. The Sith vanished again, their work complete. They had not destroyed the Republic. They had weakened its faith. And Yoda, though called a hero, could not feel pride. He stood before the council as they declared the conflict over. The words echoed like false thunder. He knew better. The dark had only retreated to wait. The embers still glowed beneath the ashes. He looked upon the new generation of Jedi, benighted bright faces, calm hearts, and the same unshakable belief that they had restored balance. And he smiled, softly, sadly, because he had lived long enough to know what they did not. Wars do not end. They only rest. And when they wake again, they never remember why they began. The end of the war came quietly. No banners, no songs, just exhaustion. Worlds that had once burned now drifted in cold peace. The Senate called it a triumph. The Council called it balance restored. But Yoda knew better. He had walked through too many ruins to mistake silence for harmony. In the years that followed, the galaxy tried to rebuild. Temples were rededicated. Monuments were raised to the fallen. Children born after the fighting grew up believing the Jedi had ended darkness forever. But in Yoda's eyes, the shadows never left. They only learned to move slower. He spent the first decades after the war traveling, not as a general, not as a hero, as a witness. On Chandrila, he spoke with farmers who refused to rebuild their homes on the ashes of others. On Onderon, he stood in the forests where entire tribes had vanished, leaving only broken armor and echoes in the Force. Everywhere he went, people thanked him. And everywhere he went, he wished they wouldn't. Because gratitude felt like denial. The Jedi had survived, yes. But what had they become? He watched young knights return from battle and struggle to meditate. He saw Padawans train not for peace, but for readiness. Even the council chamber felt heavier, the air thick with caution, as if wisdom itself had turned defensive. Peace had changed them more than war ever did. One evening, Yoda walked the temple corridors and found the Padawan archives dark. Inside, a small boy slept against the shelves, a training saber beside him. Yoda woke him gently. The child opened his eyes and whispered, "I wanted to be strong, like you." Yoda smiled faintly. "Strong, I am not," he said. "Endured, I have. Different things, they are." The boy didn't understand. Neither had Yoda once. He left the chamber in silence. Outside, the night over Coruscant glowed dimly, the city alive again with lights that looked like stars. But to Yoda, they no longer shone. They flickered. He returned to the council the next morning. They spoke of reconstruction, of diplomacy, of maintaining order. They spoke of victory. Yoda asked only one question. If victory is peace, why restless the Force still feels? No one answered. Over the next century, the galaxy healed, at least on the surface. Trade resumed. New hyperspace routes opened. The Republic grew wealthier, older, slower. And through it all, Yoda remained the same. Still teaching, still guiding, still listening. But he felt it, always that distant hum beneath calm, like something breathing in the dark corners of time. He began meditating deeper, reaching through layers of the Force most Jedi feared to touch. Not for power, for understanding. And one night, the Force showed him, not a vision, a memory, of a hand unseen shaping events from the edges of history, of faces lost in centuries past, whispering to those yet to come, of light forever chasing its own shadow. He woke trembling. The war, he realized, had never ended. It simply waited between generations. It lived in fear, in pride, in the certainty of peace. That was the truth the Jedi refused to face. Because if they admitted it, they would have to change. And they would not. So Yoda carried the knowledge alone. He did not write it in the archives. He did not speak it in council. He kept it buried in the quiet of his meditation chamber, repeating one sentence like prayer. Endless, the struggle is not between Sith and Jedi, but within all who seek the light. He aged slowly, watching students become masters, masters become history. Centuries passed like seasons, and through it all, the same mistakes returned in different names. But he did not despair. Not fully. Because even in failure, the Force endured. Even in darkness, there was purpose. He had seen enough to know that the galaxy was not meant to be one only understood. The Republic slept under the illusion of peace. The Sith hid in forgotten corners, patient as always. And Yoda watched, waiting for the next shadow to rise. He had learned what few ever do. That victory is not the end of war. It is only the beginning of forgetting. And forgetting in the galaxy he had sworn to protect was the first step toward falling again. The seat was carved from stone, worn smooth by centuries of those who sat before him. But when Yoda first took his place on the High Council, it felt cold. Not because of the chamber, because of what he felt just beneath it. The Force hummed in that room, ancient, focused, restrained. 12 voices bound in purpose. But even then, he could feel it. The shift. Small, subtle, like gravity changing just enough to tilt the future. The Jedi Order had grown strong. Too strong. The wars were over, the Sith were believed extinct, and the Republic was stable. And in that illusion of peace, the Council had grown certain. Yoda watched them, listened to them. He offered his thoughts rarely, always with care. And yet, he saw the way they leaned toward unity over truth. Consensus had become currency. Dissent, a discomfort. He felt it when they discussed diplomacy, how easily they favored intervention. He felt it when they spoke of training, how quickly they placed Padawans into roles that demanded obedience before understanding. And he felt it most during silence. There were moments when no one spoke. Moments where something should have been said. But no one did. He began meditating more. Not for clarity, for warning. He sensed disturbances, not visions. Whispers, faint, fleeting images that disappeared before he could fully grasp them. A cloaked figure on the steps of the temple, a blade igniting in a child's hand, the sound of a voice calling out across generations. They came during council sessions. While others debated policy, Yoda stared into nothing and listened. He knew the Force was trying to speak. But the galaxy had grown too loud. So he turned inward. He began to observe his fellow masters more closely. He noticed how some of them had begun to speak with authority, not humility. How they dismissed the young more quickly. How they feared change, even while preaching openness. He said nothing. Not because he agreed. Because he feared how close he had come to the same. Wisdom was a burden, yes. But power was a temptation. Even wisdom could not always silence. He had lived long enough to know that even the Jedi were not beyond corruption. Only beyond admitting it. It was during these years that he began to teach more deeply. Not just forms, not just control but perception. He challenged his students to question their own thoughts, to observe others without judgment, to sense the ripples before they became waves. Some listened. Most did not, but a few stood out. Young minds whose strength was matched by insight, whose potential felt dangerous, not because of darkness, because of brilliance. Yoda watched them closely, guided them without force, shaped them gently, hoping to give them the tools he himself had lacked. But the shadows in the Force continued to grow, not in explosions, not in betrayals, in decisions made quietly, repeated often. He saw how the Council began to bend toward the Republic's needs, how the Senate's words held more weight than the Force's silence. And he began to wonder if the Order had traded balance for favor. He said nothing. Not yet. Because the voices in the shadows were still forming, still watching, still waiting. But Yoda knew, as he sat in the highest seat of the Jedi Temple, that the darkness would not come screaming into the light. It would arrive as it always had. In whispers. He had taught many. Some passed through like falling leaves, brief, quiet, and forgotten. Others lingered. But a few, a very few, left echoes. One of them was named Dooku. He arrived at the temple with the sharpness of a blade not yet drawn. Even as a child, he carried himself like he already understood something others didn't. Yoda saw it immediately. The potential, the danger. The boy was brilliant, eager to learn, hungry to master the teachings that others took years to understand. He debated his instructors. He challenged traditions. He studied the ancient texts late into the night, asking questions not even masters wanted to answer. Others called him difficult. Yoda called him necessary, because the Order needed minds that asked why, even when it was uncomfortable. Especially then, Yoda trained him himself, not with strictness, with care. He did not seek to tame Dooku. He sought to anchor him, to show him that knowledge was not enough, that wisdom was learning when not to speak, when not to strike, when not to know. And for a time, it worked. Dooku rose quickly through the ranks. Respected, feared, admired. But admiration, Yoda knew, was the first step toward separation. Dooku began to see the Order not as sacred, but flawed. He spoke openly of the Senate's corruption, of the Jedi's blindness, of the Council's reluctance to act when injustice stood in plain view. He was not wrong, but he was not patient. Yoda watched as the fire in him began to shift. Not burn brighter, burn hotter. Dooku's victories in diplomacy were precise, cold, often without compassion. His missions brought order, but rarely peace. The other masters praised his efficiency. Yoda worried about his distance. He spoke with him often, alone in the meditation halls. Reminded him that the Force was not a tool but a companion. That peace was not something won, But something maintained breath by breath, moment by moment. Dooku would nod, bow, smile that quiet smile of his. But his eyes had already begun to look past the temple walls. He wasn't alone. Mace Windu was another. Different from Dooku, colder, more disciplined but no less certain. Where Dooku questioned the Council's indecision, Mace questioned the galaxy's morality. To him, justice had to be enforced. Balance had to be held in place, even when it resisted. Yoda respected him deeply, admired his control, feared his rigidity. Mace was loyal, unshakably so. But Yoda wondered, what would happen if the truth ever demanded disobedience? He never found out. Because Mace rose quickly, joined the Council, and became its enforcer, the voice of action when others hesitated. And the Order leaned into that voice. Too much. Yoda stood between them, one student who burned too hot, another who stood too still. And he began to wonder if both were reflections of the same flaw. Not in them, in him. He had taught them both, trusted them, guided them. But perhaps he had taught them to be strong, before teaching them to be still. He began to withdraw, not from duty, from pride. He no longer believed the Council would always make the right choice, but he still believed in the Force. And when he taught now, he spoke less of power, less of victory. He spoke of loss, of patience, of letting go. Few listened, but those who did, he remembered. Because one day, he knew they would need those lessons. Not for battle, but for survival. Because pride, he had learned, was not always loud. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it bowed. And sometimes it called itself wisdom. The temple felt colder after Dooku left. He didn't storm out. He didn't shout. He simply walked away. His resignation was delivered with grace and silence. No ceremony, no farewell. Only a single line written into the records. The galaxy has changed. I must change with it. Yoda read the words alone in the archive chamber and said nothing, because he had seen it coming. Years before, he had watched Dooku grow distant, less engaged, less trusting. The questions that once made him curious had become accusations. The passion that once drove him to understand had hardened into judgment. He had spoken often of corruption in the Senate, of weakness in the Jedi, of lost causes defended only to preserve image. And when the Council remained silent when it voted for restraint, for patience, for faith, Dooku turned his gaze elsewhere. Yoda had tried to stop it. In the final days of Dooku's time with the Order, the two met beneath the meditation tree, the same one where Yoda had trained him as a child. "Leave, you are planning," Yoda said. Dooku didn't deny it. He only asked, "What happens when wisdom becomes cowardice?" Yoda looked at him, long and steady. "Then patience is tested, but fallen it has not." Dooku lowered his gaze, and for a moment, he looked like the boy he once was. Lost, but not yet gone. He bowed and left. That was the last time Yoda saw him as a Jedi. The galaxy spoke little of Dooku in the years that followed. He became a noble on Sereno, reclaiming the title of Count his family had long abandoned. To the Republic, he was a diplomat. To the Jedi, a memory. But to Yoda, he was a shadow, not behind him, but ahead. The Force still trembled around his name. And in meditation, Yoda would sometimes feel a presence watching him. not with hatred, with disappointment. Then the rumors began. A movement, a separatist cause rising across the outer rim, quiet at first, then louder. More systems joining every cycle. More senators questioning the Republic's promises. And behind it all, whispers of a leader, elegant, persuasive, unseen. When the name was finally confirmed, Yoda did not speak. He simply closed his eyes and breathed. Count Dooku, his student, his legacy had become the face of rebellion. And the galaxy listened to him. Not because he threatened, because he told the truth. Half-truths, bent truths, but truths nonetheless. Dooku spoke of Senate greed, of Jedi pride, of injustice dressed in law. And the people believed him, because deep down, some of it was real. The council debated what to do. Some called for immediate action. Others called for negotiation. Yoda sat in silence, then spoke. Truth, even twisted, can shape fate. Speak to him, I must. But the message never reached him. Dooku was always somewhere else, always just out of reach. The war had not yet begun, but the lines were being drawn. And Yoda knew his greatest failure was still writing the future. He sat alone in the temple's highest chamber that night, watching the stars drift by, and whispered a question only the Force could hear. Where did I lose him? The Force did not answer, because some echoes are meant to haunt. The council stood tall, but its foundation had begun to shift. Dooku was gone. The Republic was fraying, and the Force was no longer still. Yoda felt it each morning when he woke. In the stillness before dawn, when the temple was silent, something stirred in the depths of the Force. A hum that should not be there. A thread being pulled from somewhere he could not reach. The younglings still laughed in the training halls. The knights still trained. Missions were dispatched. Records were written. But the deeper Yoda looked, the more he saw the truth. The Jedi were growing more powerful but less connected. More active but less aware. The galaxy praised them, called them peacekeepers, guardians, heroes, and that was the danger. He stood before the council one evening after a troubling vision, vague and broken, but filled with fire and silence and names he could not yet place. He told them the dark side had grown stronger. They nodded, they agreed, and then moved to the next agenda. Yoda said no more, because he knew then they could no longer feel what he felt. Not fully, not deeply. Too many years of politics, too much trust in their own righteousness, and too little doubt. The Padawans came younger now, more eager, more powerful, but also more afraid. Yoda saw it in their eyes during training. They were not learning to serve. They were learning to survive. A few asked him why meditation had grown harder, why they struggled to quiet their minds. He never gave them answers, only questions, because to name the darkness before they were ready was to give it power. But he feared they would face it too soon. Before they knew how to listen, before they understood what it meant to be Jedi, when peace was gone, the Senate began to rely on the Council more openly. Requests for Jedi oversight grew constant. One vote failed, and suddenly, the Chancellor himself asked for Jedi intervention. Again, and again, and again. Mace believed in structure, obedience, order. Yoda believed in balance, and the balance was breaking. He began to visit the lower levels of Coruscant, away from the temple. He walked the alleyways in silence, hiding his presence in the Force. Not to be seen, to listen. He heard how people spoke of the Jedi, not with awe, with resentment. They sit above us, speak like gods. They don't know what it's like to bleed. They only come when it's too late. He returned to the temple, each time heavier than before. Not from judgment, from knowing they weren't wrong. And then the whispers began. Of a Sith. Not long dead, but living. Somewhere beneath their feet. A shadow. A phantom. A name with no face. The council did not believe it. Yoda did. Because he had already felt it. Not in a place. In the Force. Not a presence. A pull. Like gravity bending around something invisible. It wasn't just Dooku. Something older. Deeper. Patient. He meditated for hours that night, deeper than ever before. He let go of his body, of his breath, of the temple, and in that stillness he felt it. A wound, open, hidden in plain sight, not in the past, in the future. And when he opened his eyes, he whispered one name, a name he did not yet understand, but would one day come to fear. Skywalker. It began long before the first shot. Before Geonosis. Before Kamino. Before the Jedi ever held a rank. It began with silence. And a lie. Not one told with malice. Not at first. Just a lie wrapped in necessity and accepted too easily. The Republic was already breaking. Senators spoke in half-truths. Systems left the government in clusters, not in rebellion, but in exhaustion. And through it all, the Jedi remained still. Yoda remained still. The Council debated the separatist crisis for months. Was it political? Was it war? Was it something else entirely? No one knew. But something in the Force had shifted. Yoda felt it every time he entered the chamber, like the air was listening. Like something unseen was waiting for them to decide the wrong thing. The Jedi were being asked to do more than advise. They were being asked to act, to police, to protect, to prepare. And with every request, the Order moved one step further from peace, and one step closer to command. When intelligence reached the council of a possible army being commissioned for the Republic, Yoda was among the first to investigate. He did not find hope. He found Kamino, a world hidden from the Jedi archives, erased, deliberately. That should have been the warning. But the clones were already grown, already waiting, and the Kaminoans said a name Yoda knew. Master Yoda, a Jedi who had died years earlier. Too many years. Yoda did not believe it. But the army existed, and war had arrived. When the Confederacy attacked on Geonosis, the Republic had no forces, no time. The Council made a choice. Use the army. Save lives. End the threat. Yoda agreed. He led the 1st Battalion himself. He told himself it was the only way. But deep down, he already knew. This was not a rescue. It was a beginning. The clones fought with precision. They obeyed without question. They were efficient, too efficient. Yoda watched them closely. The way they looked at the Jedi, not with reverence, with expectation. They didn't follow the Jedi because of belief. They followed because they were made to. And that truth never left him. The Republic called it a triumph. The Jedi had saved them. But Yoda said nothing, because he saw the future tightening like a fist, one he had helped close. In private, he meditated for hours, not for peace, for answers. But the Force was quiet, too quiet. It did not speak of victory. It did not praise him. It showed him images he could not interpret. A temple in ruin, a boy with two names, a darkness that moved behind every light. And still, he said nothing. Because the Council believed unity was strength. Because the galaxy needed hope. Because he feared what would happen if he admitted the truth. That they had been manipulated. That they had walked into a war not as peacekeepers, but as pawns. So he stood before the Senate, calm and sure, and spoke the words history would remember. Begun, the Clone War has. The chamber erupted in cheers. Yoda did not smile, because he knew what he had done. Not just accepted the war, but given it permission. And the lie, the one wrapped in necessity, was now truth. The Jedi had become generals. The clones had become soldiers. And the Republic was no longer what it had claimed to be. The Jedi Temple was never meant for war. Its walls were built for meditation, not command. But now, every hall echoed with reports, transmissions, and orders. The sound of calm had been replaced by the rhythm of battle. Council sessions grew longer and quieter, because unity, once their strength, had become performance. The Masters disagreed more than they admitted. Mace spoke of control, of maintaining the Council's authority over the Senate. Ki-Adi-Mundi insisted the Jedi were servants of the Republic, not leaders above it. Obi-Wan believed the clones were a gift, a means to restore order. Yoda listened, and felt the distance between them widening with every word. The Force had become cloudy, like mist over a battlefield. Even the most gifted among them could no longer see clearly. Every vision ended in confusion. Every attempt to look forward ended in darkness. He told them so. He warned that the Force itself was being bent, twisted by something powerful and patient. But the others only looked at him with unease. They trusted him, but they trusted the Republic more. That was the first fracture. The Council began to divide itself, without knowing, half devoted to victory, half clinging to principle. And Yoda, caught between both, began to question his own stillness. He visited the clone barracks often, walked among them quietly without escort, listened to their stories, learned their faces. They saluted him. They respected him, but they didn't understand him. To them, the war was life. It was the only reason they existed. They were bred for loyalty, born into obedience. They believed in the Republic because they had never been taught to believe in themselves. He could feel their individuality, buried beneath programming, sparks of spirit struggling against design. He wondered what it meant to serve without choice, and if the Jedi were really so different anymore. The Council met again weeks later. Losses were growing. The war stretched across too many systems. The Senate demanded more control. Some masters wanted to limit debate. Others wanted to surrender authority to the Chancellor for efficiency. Yoda said little, but every word he didn't speak felt like a failure. because in his silence, compromise became surrender. Soon, Jedi were stationed as commanders on every front. They wore armor. They gave orders, and the galaxy cheered them for it. Yoda stayed behind, coordinating from Coruscant, a general without an army, watching from afar as his order became something it was never meant to be. He began to feel the isolation more deeply. Meditations that once brought calm now brought dread. The Force trembled beneath him, like a vast ocean hiding a storm he could no longer locate. He spoke with Mace, often in private. They disagreed quietly but constantly. Mace believed the Jedi could still control the direction of the war, that discipline would preserve them. Yoda believed the opposite, that the very act of fighting had already changed who they were. Neither convinced the other. Both understood the cost. When reports came of Dooku's increasing influence, Yoda felt the ache of old failure rise again. Every planet that joined the Separatists echoed his student's voice. Every speech Dooku gave carried the precision of lessons Yoda had once taught him. And now, his words were tearing the galaxy apart. The Council prepared new strategies, new campaigns, new hope, but Yoda no longer spoke of victory. He spoke only of survival. And in his heart, he knew the Republic they were fighting for was already gone. He never called himself a general. Others did. The Senate, the clones, even some of the Jedi. But Yoda had never trained for war. Not truly. He had studied defense, balance, connection. He had learned to listen. And now, there was nothing left to hear. The war moved too quickly. Battles erupted on a dozen fronts at once. Systems were lost before they could even be named. The Jedi were stretched thin. The Council was overwhelmed. And in the center of it all, the Grand Master. Yoda led fleets without ships. He approved missions without trust. He watched younger Jedi fall, one by one, in a war none of them had chosen. They came to him for counsel, and he gave it, calmly, carefully. But inside, something in him had begun to break. He no longer believed his words were enough. He joined the field again on Kashyyyk, where the battle was tipping toward disaster. The Wookiees welcomed him as they once had. But he was not the same Jedi who had come before. He fought now, not to teach, not to protect, to end what could no longer be delayed. He moved through the trees like wind, small, fast, relentless. Clones followed his commands without question. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He felt every death in the Force, even when he didn't see them fall. Each one passed through him like a breath held too long. He meditated during the brief lulls between attacks, not for rest, for control. Because even now, after centuries of stillness, the war had begun to pull something dark from within him. Not anger, grief, the kind that hardens slowly, quietly, until nothing soft remains. He feared that more than any enemy, because if he lost his ability to feel, he would no longer be Jedi. He received reports daily, losses, victories, ambushes, retreats. Every message began to sound the same. The Jedi were winning battles, but losing themselves. And Yoda, the one they all looked to, no longer believed they could stop it. He saw the toll in his students' eyes. The way they looked at their clone troopers like weapons, not people. the way they carried their sabers more like officers than protectors. He spoke to them when he could, tried to remind them what the Force truly was. But words fell short in the shadow of war. They needed hope, and all he could offer was caution. He returned to Coruscant briefly, walking the temple halls alone. Everything was polished, still, sacred, but it felt hollow, like they were preserving something already lost. He stood in the chamber of the younglings and watched them train. Their faces were full of light, their minds untouched by fear. And he realized then, this was what he was fighting for. Not the Senate, not the war, not even the Republic, but the chance for peace to mean something again. He bowed his head, and for the first time in decades, he prayed, not to a god, to the Force, for strength, for clarity, for one more moment of truth before the end. Because even though the galaxy still called him a general, he was not leading an army. He was carrying a burden. And it was getting heavier. The war ended the way all wars do. Not with victory, with silence. The guns quieted, the Senate cheered, and across the stars the Jedi waited for peace that never came. Yoda stood on Coruscant as the Chancellor addressed the galaxy. The man's voice filled every screen, every hall, every mind. Words of unity, of sacrifice, of survival. But beneath them, Yoda heard something else. Control, carefully hidden, perfectly shaped. He felt it through the Force, a tightening, as though an invisible hand had begun to close around everything. And still, he said nothing. He told himself it was not yet time. That patience would preserve them. That faith would reveal the truth. But the truth no longer needed revealing. It was already happening. The Jedi were no longer peacekeepers. They were soldiers waiting for orders. And the orders were no longer their own. He met with Mace Windu one last time in private. The two spoke of the Chancellor, of Dooku, of whispers of a second Sith. Mace said the words Yoda had feared for years. I think we may have been wrong to trust him. Yoda looked at him for a long moment. Wrong, yes. Too late, perhaps. The wind outside the temple carried dust from the lower city. It blew through the open windows like ash. Neither spoke again. In meditation, Yoda searched the Force for answers. He found only noise flashes of betrayal, flashes of death, and the sound of a voice he almost recognized. Execute Order 66. The moment it happened, he felt it. Across the galaxy, lights flickered and died. Every bond in the Force, every connection between master and student broke like a string cut at once. Pain surged through him. Not physical, spiritual. A fracture so deep it almost silenced him. He saw the future in that instant. And it was already gone. He escaped the attack only because the Wookiees fought for him, not because he commanded them. He fled through the forests, carrying the weight of every life that had just vanished. He reached his ship in silence. And when it lifted from Kashyyyk, he didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. When he returned to Coruscant, the temple burned. Smoke curled through the night sky like the memory of a dream. He walked through the ruins in silence, through the halls where he once taught, through the chambers where he once listened. The younglings were gone. The masters were gone. The Republic was gone. All that remained was ash and echo. He found Obi-Wan among the survivors. The younger master spoke through tears, through disbelief, through guilt. Together, they faced what none of them could accept, that the Sith had not returned. They had never left, and the war had never been theirs to win. Yoda watched the skyline of the city that had once called him savior. Now it bowed to an emperor. He said nothing, because there were no words left that mattered. The galaxy had fallen into shadow, and he had helped guide it there. He left without ceremony, without farewell. Exile, not punishment, only understanding. On Dagobah, he sat beneath endless rain, surrounded by life that asked for nothing. He meditated, but not for peace, for acceptance, because regret, he realized, could not be taught. It could only be lived. And for the first time in 9 centuries, Yoda finally understood the one lesson he had failed to see. Sometimes, the greatest act of wisdom is knowing when you were wrong. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in silence. And then, a scream. Not a sound, not a voice, but something deeper. It echoed through the Force like a wave crashing into glass. Invisible, but shattering. Instant. Yoda froze. His hand, small and weathered, slipped away from his walking stick. He staggered not from impact, but from knowledge. Something was dying. Not one life. Many. A web of voices vanishing at once. He closed his eyes and reached out, and what he felt brought him to his knees. The Jedi were falling. Across the stars, in ships, in outposts, on nameless planets, they were being erased. Not hunted, not betrayed, executed. The word didn't need to be spoken, but somewhere it was. Order 66. 3 numbers, hidden inside a war that had already lost its meaning. Yoda clutched the moss beneath him. The battle on Kashyyyk raged in the distance, but it no longer mattered. The real battle had begun elsewhere, and they were losing. He tried to call out to the Force, to the Jedi, to anyone still listening. But the connections were already gone, cut clean. Each one had been a thread, and now the tapestry was falling apart. He stood again, not because he was ready, because there was no other choice. The clone commander at his side, loyal, efficient, brave, turned without hesitation. His weapon raised, his heart steady. Yoda didn't flinch. He didn't draw his blade. He simply moved. Faster than sound, quieter than thought. The clones around him dropped before they could speak, not because he hated them, because they didn't know. They were not the enemy. They were the weapon. Yoda stepped back into the trees. The Wookiees followed, roaring in confusion. But he said nothing. There was nothing to explain. The truth was too large for words now. He climbed to higher ground, above the canopy, where the sky burned with smoke from Republic cruisers. He looked up, and for the first time in centuries, he felt small. Not in body, in fate. The war was over, not because it had ended, because its purpose had been fulfilled. Palpatine had won, not through strength, through design. Every move, every delay, every compromise led to this, and Yoda, for all his wisdom, had seen it too late. He pressed his hand to the bark of the tree beside him. It was warm, alive. The Force still flowed. Here, now. But the Jedi were gone. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply listened. And in that silence, he heard the faintest echo of what once was. The laughter of younglings in the temple, the whispers of council debate, the soft hum of sabers in the training halls, all gone, all memory. He inhaled, and when he exhaled, the air felt colder. He turned to the Wookiees, his friends, his protectors, and he bowed. They didn't understand, but they bowed back. And that was enough. He made for his ship, slowly, but without pause. The galaxy was falling, and he had to see it with his own eyes. Not to change it, not to fight it, to understand it, because somewhere in that collapse was the key to what must come next. Not revenge, not war, truth. And it was buried now beneath lies, beneath power, beneath the armor of a boy he once knew. But Yoda would find it, even if it cost him everything. The flight to Coruscant felt longer than any journey Yoda had ever taken. The stars outside the viewport blurred together, but he did not watch them. He sat motionless in the pilot's chair, eyes closed, hands still. There was no meditation left in him, only quiet and memory. The temple had called to him in the Force, not as it once did a beacon of peace, a harmony of minds. Now it cried, a wound torn open in the heart of the galaxy. He felt it before he saw it. Pain without direction, voices without breath, an emptiness that hummed like broken glass. When his ship descended into the atmosphere, the city below glowed red. Fire, not light. Columns of smoke rose into the upper levels, curling against the endless night. The temple stood in shadow, silent, bleeding. He landed in a hidden bay beneath the main spire, where once the training vessels had been stored. Now, the floor was covered in ash. Every step he took left prints that vanished behind him. The halls were darker than he remembered. The lights flickered. Sparks danced where blaster bolts had carved the walls. He moved slowly, his footsteps quiet, though the silence no longer cared. At the entrance to the archives, he stopped. He could smell the fire before he saw it. The great library, the history of 1,000 generations, burned in blue and orange flame. He stepped inside. The air was thick, alive with heat and sorrow. Holocrons shattered on the floor, their crystal cores melting like tears. He reached down and lifted one fragment, Master Jocasta News records. The names of younglings, gone. He placed it back among the ashes and whispered, "Forgive us." In the distance, something cracked. A statue fell. The sound echoed like thunder through the dead halls. He made his way to the council chamber. 12 chairs, 12 ghosts. He paused where his seat had been, ran his hand across the polished stone, still warm from fire. He could almost hear them, Mace, Ki-Adi-Mundi, Plo Koon, their voices overlapping in debate. Now, nothing but wind. He sat down, not as Grand Master, as the last witness. The galaxy would remember the Jedi as traitors. He already knew that. The Senate had likely declared it before the fires had even cooled. History was already being rewritten, and he could do nothing to stop it. He closed his eyes and reached out one final time. Through the Force, through the ruin, through the noise. At first, nothing. Then, a spark, faint, alive, a presence he knew, familiar, distant. Obi-Wan. The Force carried the message across the void. Not words, understanding. They were not alone. Not yet. Yoda rose. His body trembled from age, from grief, from exhaustion. But his spirit did not falter. He had failed to prevent the fall, but he would not fail to remember it. He made his way down the inner corridors, past the classrooms where laughter had once filled the air, past the meditation rooms where peace had lived, past the walls carved with the marks of 1,000 sabers. He stopped at one door, the nursery. He could not enter. He already knew what waited beyond it. The air outside the chamber felt colder. He bowed his head and whispered again. Young they were, braver than we. Then he turned away. The dawn over Coruscant was dim, hidden behind smoke. The sun rose, but it brought no light. From the temple steps, Yoda looked out at the skyline of the city that had outgrown its soul. Every tower gleamed. Every voice below cheered the Empire's birth. He had lived long enough to see peace become tyranny, light become weapon, faith become blindness. He would not live to see it again. He stepped onto his ship. The ramp closed, and as the engines lifted him into the clouds, the temple vanished beneath him, swallowed by the haze. He did not look back, because to look back would mean to break, and he could not afford to break. Not yet. He found him where power always hides at the center. The Senate Rotunda stood silent, its seats empty, its walls echoing the birth of empire. The room that had once held democracy now served as a throne. Sidious waited there. No disguise, no mask, only truth. His voice filled the chamber like thunder wrapped in silk. So, it comes to this, he said. Master Yoda. Yoda stepped forward, slowly, calmly. The two had shared the same city for years, breathed the same air, spoken in the same halls. One guiding light, one waiting shadow. And yet neither had truly seen the other until now. The air between them rippled not with anger, but inevitability. The Force trembled as if the galaxy itself were holding its breath. Yoda's eyes rose to meet the Sith's. Powerful you have become. The dark side, I sense in you clearly. Sidious smiled. His face was calm, confident, certain. Your arrogance blinds you, Master Yoda. At last the Jedi are no more. Lightning struck before the words had faded. A storm born from hate and history. Yoda raised his hand. The energy met him, blue against green, light against will. For a moment, time stopped. Then, everything exploded. The blast hurled them both backward. Sidious laughed not in joy, but in triumph. Because this was never about victory. It was about ending belief. They fought across the Senate chamber as pods rose like ghosts around them. Each strike echoed through the empty hall, each movement a reflection of centuries of faith colliding. Yoda leapt from platform to platform, his saber a green star slicing through darkness. Sidious answered with lightning, hurling the Senate itself at him. Desks shattered. Stone cracked. Light met shadow again and again until neither could be told apart. Faith in your republic failed you, Sidious shouted. Faith in your order destroyed you. Yoda did not answer. Words no longer mattered. Only balance. He deflected another surge of lightning, the sound like thunder collapsing in on itself. The energy crackled between them, raw and blinding. And for an instant, Yoda saw not a Sith Lord but a man consumed. A man who had once believed something too deeply and let it twist into ownership. He understood then. Sidious was not the cause. He was the result, the mirror the Jedi refused to face. Their battle reached the central podium. The platform rose slowly toward the high dome above, the entire hall spinning around them like the galaxy itself. Lightning struck again. Yoda caught it, held it. For a moment, he almost turned it back. But balance demanded truth, not domination. The Force surged, and the energy blew them apart. Sidious fell backward, tumbling down the shaft of the chamber, laughing. Yoda clung to the edge, breathing hard, robes torn, saber gone. He had not been defeated by strength. He had been undone by destiny. He looked down at the Sith, tiny in the distance, surrounded by the remnants of what once was government. Sidious rose slowly, robes billowing like the night itself. Their eyes met again, one filled with victory, the other with understanding. Yoda turned away. He leapt down through a maintenance hatch, vanishing into the maze below. He could hear Sidious's laughter echoing after him, fading only when he reached the dark tunnels beneath the Senate. He stopped there, in shadow. His breathing slowed. His mind quieted. He had lost. But he was still alive. And that meant something. He pressed his hand to the wall, feeling the vibration of engines above. The machinery of Empire already turning. He whispered softly, "Failed, I have, but end, this is not." Because he understood what the Sith never would, that power ends where memory begins. He would live, not to fight, to remember. Because someday, the galaxy would need that memory again. The stars above Polis Massa were quiet. Too quiet for a galaxy still burning. The outpost was small, hidden in the asteroid field, known to few. Its tunnels were cold, its lights dim. But for Yoda, it was not a place of exile. It was a place of truth. Obi-Wan had arrived before him, carrying a child, eyes wide, silent. Padme was gone. Anakin was gone. The Jedi were gone. But something remained. 2 children. Twins. Born in the shadow of ruin. Alive in the light of a promise not yet made. Yoda stood at the edge of the chamber where the newborns slept. He did not speak. He only listened. To their breath. To the Force around them. It stirred differently now. Quieter, but not broken. Hope, the kind the Jedi had forgotten, had taken a new form. Small, fragile, but alive. He turned to Obi-Wan. The man's face held lines that had not been there days before. Grief changed the shape of people. "There is still a way," Yoda said. Obi-Wan nodded. They both knew what it meant. Separation, secrecy, sacrifice. Leia to Alderaan, Luke to Tatooine. Far apart, but never alone. The Force would carry them, even if they never knew it. Bail Organa spoke briefly. So did Obi-Wan. But Yoda said little. He had spoken too much in his lifetime already. Now, his silence mattered more than his voice. Later, alone in the chamber, Yoda sat cross-legged on the floor. He reached into the Force, not to guide it, but to surrender. He felt the echoes of all that had passed. The screams, the sabers, the fire. But deeper still, he felt something older. A presence. Waiting. It was not Qui-Gon. Not yet. Only the shadow of what would one day become voice. The path to immortality was not a gift. It was a burden. But Yoda would take it, Because someday, the children would need more than lightsabers. They would need memory. He stood. His cloak brushed the cold floor. He walked toward the docking bay. Obi-Wan followed in silence. There was nothing left to say. Their next meeting would not be soon. And when it came, it would be for the end. They stood beneath the stars. 2 Jedi. No order. No temple. No titles. Just belief. Obi-Wan bowed. Yoda placed a hand on his shoulder. Then he turned, entered the ship, and disappeared. The journey to Dagobah was not charted. The path was known only to him. Through unmarked space, through the dust of forgotten systems. When he arrived, the planet welcomed him without question. The swamps breathed. The trees whispered. The Force was alive here, untamed, unshaped, pure. He made no temple, no chamber, only a hut. Small, enough. He lived simply. A pot, a bed, a fire, and time. Endless time. He watched the stars, listened to the creatures, spoke sometimes to the Force, and waited. Not in despair, in patience. He thought often of Anakin, not as Darth Vader, but as the boy, the Padawan, the one who smiled too quickly and asked questions that made others uncomfortable. He remembered his fall and his pain, but he also remembered that even the deepest darkness begins with hope. Years passed, then decades. The galaxy changed, but Dagobah did not. And Yoda remained. Not lost, not hidden, waiting, because the Force had not finished its story, and neither had he. It was not mapped, not named by the Order, not marked by the Republic. Dagobah was forgotten, even by the Force. And that's why it called to him. The journey there was not calculated. It was felt. Through debris fields and silent sectors, past the noise of a galaxy still trying to pretend nothing had changed. The stars grew dimmer, the silence deeper, until only one world remained. A green moon lost in shadow. From orbit, it looked lifeless. But the moment his ship reached the clouds, the Force began to breathe again. Not like it had on Coruscant, loud, structured, bright. This was different. Old, organic, wounded. The air was thick. The light barely reached the ground. The swamp whispered with a voice that didn't belong to anything alive, yet had always been there. Dagobah didn't offer shelter. It didn't welcome him. It simply allowed him to stay. Yoda stepped from the pod slowly. He carried nothing, not even his lightsaber. There was no one left to fight. The mud clung to his feet. The vines pulled at his robes. Creatures moved in the fog, not in fear, but in recognition. Even here, he could not disappear completely. He wandered for days, not to explore, but to listen. Each step reminded him he was not a warrior, not anymore. He didn't build a fortress, only a hut, woven from branches and bark, held together with quiet hands and the breath of the Force. The galaxy had burned, and in its ashes, he had buried himself. For the first time in 900 years, there was no council, no Padawan, no battles, no senate, only the sound of wind through the trees. He waited for peace. It never came, because Dagobah was not peace. It was reflection, and memory, and rot. The Force was strong here because the veil was thin. Between life and death, between truth and what the Jedi chose to believe. At night, he sat beside his fire and said no words. He didn't need to. The swamp spoke for him. It showed him visions, not of the future, but of everything he could not let go. Anakin, Dooku, Mace, the temple, their faces blurred into one, and behind them, his own. He remembered the moment he first sat on the council. So sure, so certain that wisdom was enough. But wisdom had never been the problem. The problem was blindness. The Sith had not returned because they had never left. They had waited, listened, learned, and he had been too proud to see it. Now he lived with that, in a place where pride could not breathe. He dug his food from the roots. He drank rainwater caught in leaves. He watched the stars when they broke through the clouds. They reminded him of what he once was. A child pulled from nothing, given a name, given a robe, given a purpose he was never allowed to question. But Dagobah asked no questions and gave no answers, only time. Years passed, then more. He did not count them, because counting meant he was waiting, and he had stopped waiting. Even the Force seemed to forget him, and that, more than anything, gave him peace, because it meant he had finally disappeared, not from the galaxy, but from the path that had led him to its ruin. Here, he was not Grand Master, not warrior, not legend. He was a shadow beneath the roots, a whisper in the mist. And for the first time in 1,000 years, he was just Yoda. The roots of Dagobah went deeper than stone. They reached through the mud, through the history of the planet, and into him. Yoda didn't sleep like he once had. He didn't dream. Not the way Jedi did those guided dreams meant to bring clarity. His dreams here were different. They did not teach. They remembered. Faces he had forgotten returned. Smiles turned to silence. Voices rose, then disappeared beneath the earth. Some nights, he heard Dooku's voice. Calm, precise. Not in anger, but in doubt. Dooku had asked questions, hard ones, and Yoda had told him to be patient. That the galaxy would correct itself. It never had. And Dooku had left, not because he hated the Jedi, but because the Jedi stopped listening. Other memories came slower. The younglings he had trained. Thousands of them, each one different, each one sacred. Now, most were gone. The memory that returned most often was not of war, but of stillness. The quiet moments between battles. When Yoda would walk the halls of the temple and feel peace. That peace had been an illusion, an echo of a time that never really existed. The temple had become a prison, and the Jedi, its guards. Dagobah had no temple, no archives, no statues, but it remembered the Force, and so did he. He remembered his first lightsaber, the weight of it, the hum of the blade when it first ignited. He had felt proud and afraid. Now he no longer carried one. The weapon that once defined him was buried beneath the swamp, not out of shame, but necessity. A lightsaber was not what would save the galaxy, and it was never what had saved him. He survived because he stopped clinging to the past, and because he started listening again. The cave was not far from his hut. Small, sunken, alive in a way no cave should be. He had found it by accident. Or so he thought. The dark side pulsed from its center, not in anger, but in truth. He had entered once, only once, and what he saw there never left him. His own reflection, a twisted version of himself, not a Sith, not a fallen Jedi, just a shadow made of fear. Fear of what he had done, of what he hadn't done. The cave showed him no lies, only what was already there. He left without speaking, and never returned, because he didn't need to. The truth it showed him was not a lesson. It was a scar, and some scars are better left closed. The seasons changed, but he did not. He did not grow stronger or wiser. He only grew quieter. Even the animals grew used to him. They no longer fled, no longer circled him in caution. To them, he was just another branch in the mud, another whisper in the vines. Some days he watched the mist curl through the trees and wondered if it remembered the war, if it mourned too. The galaxy spun on, but Yoda remained still. He did not know if the Republic still existed. He did not care, because what he had lost was not a government, not an order, but a way of being. The Jedi had taught him to lead, but never to grieve. Here, he learned, not all at once, not with answers, but with acceptance. He grieved the way only someone who lived too long could. Without tears, without sound, with stillness. And in that stillness, something began to return. Not hope, not yet, but readiness. Something was coming. Something the Force did not name, but hinted at in shadows. And so he stayed, rooted, alone, watching the galaxy from beneath the roots, waiting for the story to return to him. Not everything that fell into the swamp stayed buried. Some things followed, even across the stars, even across decades. It had no form, no name, no lightsaber or voice, but it was there, a shadow, and it knew him. Yoda had felt it before, in the cave, in the stillness after the Clone Wars, in the silence that followed Order 66. But here, it did not speak. It waited. It watched, as if it, too, had been wounded by what had come before. He didn't fight it, because you cannot fight something that lives inside you. It was the dark side, not in war, but in regret. A quiet presence shaped by loss, shaped by every choice not made. It clung to him in the rain, sat with him beneath the canopy, hung low over the water, like a mirror waiting to reflect what he didn't want to see. He would sometimes speak aloud, not to the swamp, not to the Force, but to the part of himself that still doubted. Was I wrong to train them? Was I wrong to trust them? Was I wrong to stay hidden? No answers ever came, because the answers weren't missing. They were buried beneath the weight of survival. The shadow didn't accuse him. It didn't punish him. It simply reminded him that for all his power, he had failed. Not as a Jedi, but as a teacher and as a friend. Anakin's face returned more than the others. Not in anger, not in fire, but in sorrow. The boy who had laughed, the boy who had tried, the boy who had begged for understanding. Yoda had seen the darkness in him, but he had never seen the loneliness. Now, in exile, that loneliness was his own. One day, while walking near the edge of the bog, Yoda paused. The air had shifted, not in danger, but in memory. A vision, brief, vivid, the Jedi temple, standing silent, its halls empty, its statues cold. Then the council chamber, the chairs gone, only light falling through broken glass. And standing in the center, a child. He was too far to see the face, too far to speak, but the force pulsed around the vision like a heartbeat. Then it was gone. Yoda said nothing. He returned to his hut, but something had changed. The shadow had grown quieter, as if it too had felt the pulse. Hope is not always bright. Sometimes it moves in darkness. Sometimes it wears a face not yet known. The swamp remained the same. The days passed. The sounds of life and decay continued. But now, the shadow followed more loosely, as if preparing to leave. He wondered then if he was being watched. Not by beasts, not by Sith, but by the Force itself, not judging him, not guiding him, simply observing, waiting for him to be ready, not to fight, not to return, but to become what he was always meant to be, a witness, a keeper, not of tradition, but of truth. He began to speak again, only in the mornings, only to the fog. Words like, lost, they are, blind, we were. Still, the story continues. He wasn't sure who he was speaking to, but he knew someone, someday, would listen. Maybe not soon, maybe not for years, but the Force would send them. When it was time, and when they came, he would be ready. Not as a warrior, not as a master, but as a shadow that no longer followed, but waited. The days blurred into each other. On Dagobah, time had no rhythm, only repetition. He rose with the mists, slept when the insects went quiet. A cycle of silence, but the silence no longer hurt. It had become something else. A shelter, a form of healing that words could not explain. He no longer tried to be the Grand Master. He no longer tried to be anything at all. And in that surrender, the Force began to speak again. Not with visions, not with commands, but with breath, with stillness, with understanding. The truth came slowly, like the movement of roots underground. That he had not failed because of what he did, but because of what the Jedi had forgotten. They had made the Force a doctrine, a map, a hierarchy of light against dark. But the Force was never meant to be controlled, only understood, only felt. Dagobah understood this. Its balance was not pretty, not serene, but it was whole. Death fed life, decay fed renewal. The light did not destroy the dark, it grew beside it. And somewhere in that truth, Yoda found peace. He began to sense something. A thread, distant, unformed. It moved through the galaxy, small, flickering. It reminded him of a child's breath, soft, unsteady, but full of potential. He did not chase it. He only watched. Let the thread pull closer, until, one day, it did. He felt it before the ship entered the atmosphere, before the sensors in his hut blinked to life, before the vines shifted from the winds of descent. It was not a warning, it was a whisper. She had come. Not a Jedi. Not yet. But someone who would need to know. He stood at the edge of the marsh, hood raised, staff in hand. And he waited. The ship settled. Steam hissed from beneath it. And the hatch opened. She stepped out. Alone. Determined. She looked around like someone expecting a fight. But Dagobah did not fight. It only watched. He did not speak first. Because some things should not be rushed. She would ask. She would doubt. She would challenge. And he would answer. Not as a teacher. Not as a master. But as someone who had lived through the fall and stayed standing. Her name was not important yet. Only her presence. She carried pain. He could feel it. The pain of loss. The confusion of destiny. The weight of questions no one had answered. He had once been that child. He would not repeat the same mistake. So he said nothing. Not at first. He let the silence speak. Let the swamp speak. Let the force speak. And when she was ready, she listened. That moment, it was not loud, not dramatic, but it was the spark, not of war, not of prophecy, but of connection. The kind that outlives history. The kind that changes fate not through power, but through patience. She stayed. For how long, he could not say. Time did not work on Dagobah, but in those days, he taught her not how to fight, not how to destroy, but how to feel, how to fall and rise again, how to carry pain, without letting it turn to hate. And when she left, he said nothing more than goodbye, because he knew the force had moved again. And the silence had done its work. He returned to his hut, and the shadow did not follow. It stayed where it belonged, buried in the swamp, beneath the roots, gone. He sat alone, as he always had. But it was no longer exile. It was purpose. And somewhere in the galaxy, a story began again. When the ship came down through Dagobah's clouds, it wasn't the sound that woke Yoda. It was the force. Sharp, bright, clumsy, hopeful, like a candle flickering in a storm. He didn't move at first, didn't rise from his sitting place, didn't reach for his staff. He just listened. There had been others who wandered this far into the unknown. Pilots, outlaws, drifters. But this wasn't the same. This one didn't come seeking shelter. He came looking for someone. And Yoda already knew who it was. The boy stepped into the swamp like someone chasing answers, not knowing he was dragging questions behind him. His name was Luke Skywalker. But to Yoda, he was something else. He was a memory, a warning, a reflection. He walked with the same impatience, spoke with the same fire, the same anger that once stood beside Yoda in a temple hallway, fists clenched, eyes full of betrayal. The same pain that had shattered everything. Luke had his father's blood, and for Yoda, that was not just a burden. It was a scar. He watched from the shadows, not out of fear, but caution. He needed to see what kind of boy this really was. Not the one Obi-Wan believed in, not the one the rebellion needed, the one the Force had allowed to survive. Luke stumbled, fell, yelled. He called out for Ben. He cursed the swamp. He demanded purpose. And still, Yoda said nothing. Because if Luke could not learn to listen in silence, he could never hear the Force. Eventually, the boy found the hut, or maybe the hut let itself be found. And when he entered, wide-eyed and soaked with rain, Yoda played a part he hadn't touched in decades. The fool, the trickster, the harmless thing in the corner. It wasn't a lie. It was a test, not of strength, but of patience. And Luke failed it. He was quick to anger, quick to demand, quick to judge. Like Anakin, Yoda watched the same patterns unfold, the same energy, the same hunger to leap without looking. But this time, the Jedi were gone. There was no council, no temple, no rules to hide behind. There was only Yoda, and the last thread of the Jedi path, tied to a boy who wasn't ready to walk it. Luke spoke of wars, of duty, of destiny, but not once did he speak of peace. Not once did he ask what the Force wanted, only what he wanted from it. And yet, Yoda saw something else. Beneath the pride, beneath the temper, there was sorrow, the kind only loss could carve. Luke had known death, had tasted fear, had stood alone and still chosen to keep moving. That mattered. That's what made him different. Not his bloodline, not his name, but his willingness to feel pain and still return to the light. Yoda let the act fade. He let the boy see who he truly was. And when he said, "I cannot teach him," he wasn't speaking to Obi-Wan. He was speaking to the Force. Because this wasn't training. It was goodbye. He knew what was coming. Luke would leave. He would fall. He would return changed. Or not at all. And there was nothing Yoda could do to stop it. All he could do was prepare him. Not for victory, but for choice. The hut creaked in the wind. The swamp whispered. And a new chapter of the old story began again. Not with fanfare, not with hope, but with a quiet warning in the dark. A final chance. A last hope. Training Luke was never about power. It was about restraint. And restraint was something Luke had never learned. He could lift rocks, but not doubt. He could face stormtroopers, but not himself. Every lesson Yoda gave him began the same way, in stillness. In the sound of rain falling through leaves. In the quiet rhythm of breath. Feel the Force around you, Yoda said. Luke nodded, but he didn't listen. He wanted motion. He wanted proof. He wanted answers that could be seen. But the Force could not be seen. It could only be trusted. And trust was something Luke didn't yet have. The boy's impatience filled the swamp like heat before lightning. Every mistake brought anger. Every setback, blame. When he failed, he clenched his fists. When he succeeded, he smiled too soon. And every time, Yoda said less. Because words could not reach where silence was meant to teach. One morning, Luke stood before the cave. The dark side's presence lingered like a heartbeat beneath the soil. Yoda watched him from a distance. He did not warn him. He did not comfort him. He only said, "Your weapons, you will not need them." Luke didn't understand. He carried them anyway. The cave did the rest. When he emerged, his face was pale, his eyes older. He said nothing, and Yoda did not ask. Because the lesson was not what he saw. It was what he carried out with him. That day, Yoda felt the Force shift. Luke was changing, but not fast enough. Fear still moved inside him, quiet, but alive. And fear, Yoda knew, was the seed of the same shadow that had once destroyed them all. The training continued. Days passed without count. Luke lifted stones, then himself. He balanced through mud and storm. He ran, leapt, fell, rose again. But his questions never stopped. What's in there? Will I see my friends again? Will I become a Jedi? And every time, Yoda answered with silence or with something smaller than the question. Only what you take with you. Always in motion is the future. Because truth, like the Force, could not be handed over. It had to be found. Yet there was another reason for Yoda's silence. One he never told the boy. He was dying, not in body, but in spirit. The centuries had caught up with him. The wars, the failures, the exile. He had taught for a lifetime. But teaching had not saved anyone. Now, he was teaching the last one. And he did not know if it would matter. When Luke reached out with the Force, Yoda felt something he hadn't in years. Light. Unsteady. Uncontrolled. But alive. It reminded him of the way he used to feel before the war. Before the council. Before the weight of titles and expectations. For a brief moment, he believed again. But hope was dangerous. Because hope created attachment. And attachment had always led to loss. He had learned that too well. So, when the moment came when Luke sensed his friends in danger, Yoda said the words he had been dreading. You must complete the training. Luke shook his head. He couldn't. He wouldn't. He was his father's son. And Yoda knew then history was about to repeat itself. He didn't stop him. He couldn't. Because the Force was moving, and Yoda had learned the price of trying to control it. Luke ran to his ship. The engines screamed through the fog. The trees bent. And then he was gone. The silence returned. But this time, it felt heavier. Like the echo of something unfinished. Yoda turned away from the empty clearing. He sat once more by his fire. And the only words he spoke were to the Force itself. Failed again, I have. Or perhaps, not yet. The flames flickered. The mist rose. And the swamp swallowed the sound. The swamp was still, but the Force was not. Yoda felt it shift like a storm building just beyond the horizon. The moment Luke left Dagobah, something inside the galaxy cracked open. A confrontation had begun, not between Jedi and Sith, but between a father and a son, between a legacy of power and the possibility of change. He had told Luke what he needed to hear, but not what he truly needed to know. Because some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, and some choices had to be made in silence. Anakin Skywalker was not a legend to Yoda. He was a memory, a scar, a failure. The boy with the fearful eyes and untamed power. The one Qui-Gon had begged the Council to accept. The one they had trained, against Yoda's quiet warning. He had tried to prevent it. He had tried to guide him. But in the end, Yoda had watched Anakin burn the Order to the ground, not with hate, but with love twisted into obsession. Now, that same fire lived in Luke. But there was a difference. Luke still had time. Yoda remembered what it felt like to believe in redemption. He remembered the younglings who smiled at him during lessons, the knights who bowed to him before battle. He remembered Dooku, proud, elegant, brilliant, before the darkness took him. He remembered them all. And now, There were none left, except Luke. But to save him, something had to be sacrificed. So, Yoda waited. He meditated through the winds and the rain. He whispered into the Force without words, asking questions that had no answers. And then, Luke returned. Not victorious, not whole, but changed. He carried pain now like a shadow wrapped around his soul. He had faced Vader and lost, but it wasn't the duel that haunted him. It was the truth. He had seen what he could become. And now, Luke came not for training, but for hope. Yoda could see it in his posture, in the way he asked without asking, in the silence between his words. He wanted reassurance, certainty, a path that would make things right. But there were no more paths, only choices. And Yoda knew this would be their last moment. He sat Luke down beside the fire. The boy's eyes were older now, not just wounded, but wary. Yoda said only what needed to be said. No more training do you require. Already know you, that which you need. Luke looked surprised, but he didn't argue. He had learned, at last, to listen. Then came the question. Is Darth Vader my father? Yoda closed his eyes. There was no more running. Yes. The word landed with the weight of a fallen temple. And then, Yoda gave him the truth he had never dared to share. Your father he is, but consumed by Darth Vader he was. It wasn't a denial, and it wasn't absolution. It was grief spoken in the only way Yoda could bear. He watched Luke absorb it, watched the war behind his eyes. And then, he told him one more thing. The last lesson. One thing remains, Vader. You must confront him. Then, only then, a Jedi will you be. Luke didn't speak, because he already understood. To become what he must, he had to let go. Of fear, of hope, of his father. And Yoda had to let go too. For 9 centuries he had trained Jedi, guided them, warned them, watched them fall. Now, he could do no more. His time was over. But as the light around them dimmed and the fire grew low, Yoda said one final truth. There is another Skywalker. Luke's eyes widened, but Yoda did not explain, because his voice was fading. The end had come, not with pain, but with peace. He looked at Luke one last time, and with the breath of the Force around him, he disappeared, not into death, but into the quiet. There was no body, no grave, no monument. Yoda was simply gone. Luke didn't move. He couldn't. The cloak that had once wrapped the oldest Jedi in the galaxy now lay empty in the dirt, still warm, but lifeless. Dagobah did not mourn. The swamp kept breathing, kept buzzing, kept drifting in its endless silence. But something had shifted in the Force, a quiet withdrawal, a fading echo, as if the very world had lost a heartbeat. Luke sat beside the fire long after it burned down, and when he finally stood, he stood alone. Yoda had known this moment would come, that Luke would be left with questions, regret, and fear. But he had also known that he could not follow him, not anymore. The Jedi Master had spent centuries preparing others for death, but he had never prepared himself for disappearing. Not until Dagobah. Not until he looked into Luke's eyes and saw, not a weapon, not a warrior, but a choice. The kind of choice Anakin never believed he had. For years, Yoda had waited for that. Not power, not prophecy, just a single soul, willing to decide. And when he saw it, he knew he had done all he could. It was time to return to the Force. But returning was not release. Because Yoda did not vanish into peace, he vanished into memory. And memory, in the Force, is eternal. He became part of something larger, a stream of light hidden within the shadows. Not a ghost, not an echo, but a presence that could be felt even in silence. The way he had once felt Qui-Gon. The way Obi-Wan would one day feel him. He had taught them all, and they had all left him. Now, he followed, not to rest, but to wait. To wait for the end of the story he had helped begin. In that quiet space between worlds, Yoda watched as Luke returned to the stars. He watched as the boy faced Vader, as he refused to strike, as he threw away his weapon and stood in defiance. He watched as Anakin the Fallen, the feared, the forgotten looked into his son's eyes and remembered who he was. And in that moment, something Yoda never dared to believe happened. The darkness cracked, not shattered, not destroyed, but pierced. And when Anakin Skywalker lifted his son and faced the Emperor, when he made the choice he could not make before, Yoda wept, not in sorrow, but in relief. Because after all the wars, after all the blood, after all the Jedi lost to silence and fear, the Force had found a way. Not through prophecy, but through love, and not the kind that consumes, the kind that redeems. It was not victory, it was not peace, but it was enough. Enough to prove that hope was not gone, that the Jedi were not truly extinct, that failure was not the end. Luke had stood where Anakin once fell, and he had chosen differently. And in that choice, the story turned. Years later, when the fires of Endor faded and the night returned, Luke would look into the stars and wonder if he had imagined it. The voice that whispered to him in moments of fear, the warmth that filled him when he knelt before the pyre. But it was real. Yoda was with him, always had been, just as he had been with Dooku and Mace and Obi-Wan, and just as he would one day be with the ones yet to come. Because Jedi do not die in the way others do. They leave behind light, a light that flickers through time, a light that hides in unlikely places, a light that waits to be found. And so, in the shadows of a swamp, on a world forgotten by maps, a cloak lay undisturbed. The wind rustled the trees, and the vines hung low. The stars above turned slowly. And somewhere, far beyond the stars, Yoda listened and waited for the next hope to rise. He didn't die in agony. He died in silence. There were no screams, no thunder, no defiance, just a whisper, a final exhale beneath the trees of Dagobah, where time itself had slowed to honor him. His eyes didn't close in pain but in peace, as if the Force had rocked him gently to sleep. For 900 years, he carried the galaxy on his back, and in that final moment, he let go. Luke Skywalker didn't understand what he was witnessing. He saw a master vanish, but what truly happened was far deeper. Yoda didn't fade into nothing. He returned to where all things began. The Force had always been his cradle, and now it was his grave. But even as his body disappeared, the burden did not. Yoda left the living world with wounds that didn't heal, only hidden. Regret, failure, and hope, bound together in a soul too tired to carry them any longer. He had trained the greatest Jedi, and he had failed them. He had tried to stop the dark side, and he had helped birth it. But in Luke, there was something different, something that reminded Yoda of a time before the wars, before the politics, before the council. A time when the Force was simply felt, not debated. And that is why, even at the end, Yoda smiled. Because in Luke, he saw a seed, not of the Jedi Order, but of something purer, something that might heal what he could not. Still, the ache remained, not from fear, but from memory. He had survived longer than he should have. He had watched temples fall, students betray, friends die. And through it all, he endured. Until now, when the end came, Yoda did not run. He did not fight it. He welcomed it. Not because he wanted to leave, but because he had finally found someone worth leaving it to. And as his form vanished into the air, the swamp held its breath. The Force held him close, and Yoda became more than legend. He became part of everything. There was no tunnel of light, no gates, no voices waiting beyond. There was only the Force. It surrounded him like breath, weightless and endless. Not a place, but a feeling, the same current he had touched all his life, now vast enough to drown in. Yet there was no fear, only understanding. He drifted within it, not as Yoda the Grand Master, but as the child who had once reached out to the world for the first time and heard it answer. Every soul he had ever known was here, not seen but felt. The echo of Qui-Gon's patience, the steadiness of Obi-Wan's faith, the warmth of those he had failed. They did not accuse. They did not praise. They simply were. This was the truth the Jedi had forgotten, that death was not the end of the Force. It was the moment the Force became complete. And yet, even within that peace, Yoda did not rest. Because peace was never the same as stillness. He could sense movement, threads of life, faint but bright, running through the galaxy like veins of light. Luke, Leia, and others whose names he would never know. He watched them not as a ghost chained to memory, but as a presence within the flow itself, a whisper across eternity. The living could no longer see him, but they could feel him, in the quiet before battle, in the calm that follows fear, in the pause between heartbeats, when the Force speaks without words. That was Yoda now, not a voice, but a reminder. He had once said that luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. Now, he understood what it meant. He had become the luminous part, the thread between life and death, the breath that never faded. And though his time of teaching was done, his lesson was not. The galaxy would forget his face, but not his light. Because the Force remembers everything. Always. He felt the boy tremble. Not with fear, but with choice. Yoda had seen it before, the same crossroads that had taken Anakin Skywalker, now standing before his son. But this time, there was no Jedi Council to warn him, no ancient code to bind him, no master to shape him. Only the Force, and a father's shadow. From beyond the veil, Yoda watched Luke walk that narrow line between anger and compassion, between violence and peace. He watched the boy defy everything he had been taught, and yet stay true to what mattered most. It was painful to witness, because in Luke, he saw the Jedi Yoda had once tried to be before tradition broke him, before failure defined him. The boy trusted his feelings, believed in the good that others had buried, and where others had drawn lines in the sand, Luke reached out. He saw Vader, and he saw Anakin. And for the first time since the Clone Wars, Yoda wept. Not in sorrow, in recognition. Because in that final confrontation aboard the second Death Star, above the forests of Endor, the Force tilted. Not toward the Jedi, not toward the Sith, but toward balance. Yoda had taught Luke to let go, but Luke had done something greater. He forgave. And in that moment, something ancient was healed. Anakin's redemption was not Yoda's victory. It was Luke's burden, but it echoed back across the Force, across time to the ones who had tried and failed before him. The Masters, the Padawans, the Ghosts, all of them felt it. The Skywalker line had been forged in fire, but it had found peace in mercy. And Yoda, watching from the beyond, understood at last what his own legacy meant. He was not the end of the Jedi. He was the bridge, the one who carried the old ways just far enough for someone else to find a better one. And in Luke, that path had begun. Not because of Yoda's power, but because he had finally let go.